Have you ever had your entire world shatter in front of 200 people? That's what happened to me on the most elegant night of my life. My name is Melissa Connor. For 8 years, I was married to Richard Connor, one of Boston's most successful entrepreneurs. But on that November night, during our annual charity gala, my husband took the microphone and destroyed me. I have an important announcement to make. His voice echoed. I smiled, thinking he was thanking everyone for their donations. Melissa, I want a divorce. I've met someone who makes me feel truly alive for the first time in years. He gestured toward Amber, our 24-year-old waitress. She walked over, and he took her hand right there in front of everyone. 200 people, 200 phones recording. My humiliation went viral within hours as I ran out sobbing. The divorce was brutal. Richard had protected his assets. I went from mansion to tiny apartment, from luxury to survival. I lost everything. My home, my social circle, my identity. For weeks, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. But losing everything became the greatest gift Richard ever gave me. 5 years later, everything had changed. I rebuilt my life. I went back to teaching art. I opened a community gallery for underprivileged youth. I found myself again. I surrounded myself with real friends who loved me for who I was. I started therapy. I rebuilt my confidence. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly happy. Not because of a man or money, but because I found peace. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, my past walked through the gallery door. But he wasn't the Richard Connor I remembered. He was thin, almost gaunt. Expensive suits replaced by worn clothes. Confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Melissa, he whispered, his voice breaking. Then Richard Connor fell to his knees in my art gallery. Please, I lost everything. Amber left me when my money ran out. You were right about everything, he sobbed. I was an arrogant fool. You were the best thing in my life. I have nothing except the hope that you could forgive me. I stood frozen. The man who destroyed me was now broken at my feet. 5 years ago, I would have given anything for this. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had built a new life, found happiness. Could I forgive him? Should I? Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe. Let me take you back 8 years to when I thought I had found my happily ever after. Richard and I had just gotten married, and we were on our honeymoon in the Bahamas. Everything felt like a fairy tale, the kind of love story you see in movies. He held my hand on the beach as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and promised me the world. I'll give you everything you've ever dreamed of, Melissa. You'll never have to worry about anything again. I'll take care of you, he whispered as the waves crashed behind us. And I believed him with every fiber of my being. I looked into those blue eyes and saw my future, and it looked beautiful. Back then, I was an art teacher at Lincoln Community School in a lower-income neighborhood of Boston. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't pay much, barely $35,000 a year, but I loved it with every ounce of my soul. Every morning, I'd walk into that classroom with paint-stained walls and mismatched chairs and see the faces of kids who needed someone to believe in them. Kids from broken homes, kids struggling with poverty, kids who felt invisible to the world. Art was my passion, my purpose, my calling. When I painted, when I taught, when I showed a struggling teenager how to express their pain through colors and shapes, I felt alive. I felt like I was making a real difference in this world. Richard was completely different from me. He was ambitious, driven, laser-focused, always chasing the next big deal, the next level of success. He owned a tech consulting firm called Connor Solutions that was rapidly expanding across the Northeast. While I was teaching kids to mix colors and find their creative voice, he was closing million-dollar contracts with Fortune 500 companies. Our worlds couldn't have been more different, like we came from two separate planets. But somehow, in the beginning, we balanced each other perfectly. At least, that's what I thought. He told me my creativity inspired him, that I made him see the world through a lens of beauty instead of just profit margins. I told him his ambition motivated me to dream bigger than my little classroom. 3 months into our marriage, on a rainy Tuesday evening, Richard took me to Minton, one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown Boston. The kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices and the wine list is leather-bound. Melissa, I've been thinking about something important, and I want to discuss it with you, he said, his blue eyes intense but warm. My business is growing faster than I ever expected. We just secured 3 major contracts, and I'm getting invited to events, conferences, networking dinners almost every week. I need a partner by my side at these events, someone to help me build relationships, to represent our family with grace and elegance. What would you think about leaving the school? You don't need to work anymore, sweetheart. I make more than enough for both of us. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth, a piece of perfectly prepared salmon forgotten. I don't know, Richard. Teaching isn't just about the money for me. It's never been about that. It's who I am. It's my identity, my purpose. Those kids need me. He squeezed my hand gently, his thumb rubbing circles on my skin. I know, sweetheart, and I love that about you. Your compassion, your dedication. But think about what we could build together as a real team. You could still paint, create beautiful art for our home, maybe even have your own studio where you could work whenever inspiration strikes. And when we have children, you'll already be home with them, able to give them the attention they deserve instead of being exhausted from work. This is about our future, about building something amazing together. I'm not trying to take away your art. I'm trying to give you the freedom to enjoy it without stress. The way he said it made it sound so reasonable, so logical, so loving. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't controlling. He was suggesting what seemed best for us as a couple. I gave my notice at Lincoln Community School 2 weeks later, and it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My students were devastated, especially the ones I've been mentoring closely for years. Maria, a 15-year-old girl with a difficult home life who had finally started opening up through her abstract paintings, cried when I told the class. But Miss Connor, you're the only teacher who gets me. You're the only one who doesn't treat me like I'm damaged, she said, her voice breaking. I hugged her tight, fighting back my own tears, feeling like I was abandoning her. You're going to be amazing, Maria. You have so much talent, so much to give to the world. Keep painting. Promise me you'll keep painting no matter what happens. As I packed up my classroom, taking down the student artwork from the walls, boxing up supplies we collected over years, I felt a piece of my heart physically breaking. 6 months later, we moved into a mansion in Brookline, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. It had 8 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a pool with a waterfall feature, a wine cellar, and a view of the Boston skyline that took my breath away every single time. Richard hired professional interior decorators who chose everything from the crown molding to the thread count of our sheets. We had landscapers who came twice a week, a housekeeper named Margaret who cleaned on Tuesdays and Fridays, and a chef who could prepare meals for our dinner parties. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive, curated. I walked through those enormous rooms with 20-foot ceilings and marble floors, and felt completely lost. This wasn't me. This wasn't who I was. I came from a modest middle-class family in Worcester. My parents were both public school teachers who drove the same cars for 15 years and shopped at Target. Richard started taking me to networking events, charity galas, business dinners, country club functions. I had to learn a whole new language, the unspoken language of wealth and social status. The women at these events, with their perfectly highlighted hair and Botox foreheads, talked about their vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard, their daughters at boarding schools in Connecticut, their latest purchases from Chanel and Hermes, and who was on the board of which prestigious charity. I tried desperately to fit in, to be the wife Richard needed, but I felt like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. When they asked what I did, in that polite but probing way wealthy women have, I'd say, I used to teach art at a community school. Their smiles would be polite but dismissive, their eyes already moving past me to someone more interesting. Used to. Past tense. I wasn't a teacher anymore. I wasn't really anything anymore. So who was I? Mrs. Richard Connor. That was my only identity now. Richard did give me a studio, just like he'd promised. A beautiful room on the 3rd floor with north-facing windows that let in perfect natural light, and every art supply I could possibly want. Professional-grade canvases, oil paints, watercolors, brushes from Italy, an easel that cost more than my first car. But I barely used any of it. Every time I picked up a brush, I felt completely blocked, like there was a wall between me and my creativity. The inspiration that used to flow so easily when I was teaching, when I was surrounded by my students' energy and hope, had completely dried up like a riverbed in drought. I'd sit in that perfect studio with its perfect lighting and its perfect expensive supplies, staring at blank canvases, and I'd feel absolutely nothing. Creating art alone, for myself, in isolation, wasn't the same as creating it with purpose, with students who needed it, who transformed because of it. I felt like a bird with clipped wings trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by beauty but unable to fly. As Richard's business grew exponentially, he was home less and less with each passing month. Early morning flights to New York, late-night conference calls with clients in California, weekend business trips to Chicago and Atlanta, industry conferences in Las Vegas and Miami. When he was actually home, which became increasingly rare, he was usually locked in his home office or glued to his phone, his attention a million miles away. I tried to talk to him about maybe having children, thinking a baby might give me purpose again, might fill the growing emptiness inside me. Not yet, Melissa. The business is at a critical growth stage. We're about to expand into the Midwest. Maybe in a couple years when things stabilize. A couple years turn into 5 years of the same excuse. I brought up the idea of maybe doing some volunteer teaching at a community center. You're too busy with the charity boards. I need you on for networking. Was I? I didn't feel busy. I felt empty, hollow, like I was slowly disappearing. The night of the annual charity gala, I was actually excited for the first time in months. It was November 15th, a date I'll never forget. I spent hours getting ready, choosing a beautiful navy dress that Richard had bought me from Saks. It hugged my figure perfectly and made me feel elegant, almost like my old confident self. I had my hair professionally styled, my makeup done by someone Richard hired. As I looked in the mirror, I thought maybe this would be the night we'd reconnect. Maybe in that beautiful ballroom, surrounded by people, he'd remember why he married me. Maybe he'd look at me the way he used to on our honeymoon. I was so naive, so hopeful. I put on my diamond earrings, the ones he'd given me for our 5th anniversary, and I genuinely smiled at my reflection. We arrived at the Fairmont Copley Plaza where the gala was being held. The ballroom was stunning, decorated with white roses and gold accents, with a live orchestra playing soft jazz. There were at least 200 people there, all dressed to the nines, Boston's elite, raising money for childhood literacy programs. It was the kind of event Richard loved, where business deals happened over champagne and strategic connections were made between the appetizers and main course. I took his arm as we walked in, and for a moment, I felt like we were a team again. He introduced me to several business associates, his hand on the small of my back, and I played my part perfectly. The supportive wife, the gracious hostess, smiling and making small talk about absolutely nothing of substance. We were seated at a table with other wealthy couples, people whose names appeared in Boston Magazine's power lists. Richard was polite but distracted, constantly checking his phone, even though I'd asked him earlier to try to be present. "It's just one evening," I'd said in the car. "Can we just enjoy it together?" He nodded and put his phone in his pocket, but within 20 minutes of sitting down, it was back in his hand. I tried to engage him in conversation, touching his arm, asking about his day, but his responses were brief, automatic. Then I noticed his attention shift completely. His eyes locked on something across the room, and for the first time all evening, he seemed fully present. I followed his gaze and saw her. Our waitress, a young woman with long blonde hair, probably in her mid-20s, moving between tables with natural grace and a warm, genuine smile. When she came to our table to take drink orders, Richard's entire demeanor changed. He sat up straighter, smiled wider than I'd seen him smile in months. "I'll have a scotch, neat," he said, and then added, "You're doing a wonderful job tonight. This event is beautifully organized." She smiled back, her green eyes sparkling. "Thank you so much, sir. That's very kind. It's actually my 2nd year working this gala. I'm Amber, by the way." There was something in the way she said it, familiar and friendly, that crossed the invisible line between server and guest. Richard introduced himself, shaking her hand, which servers don't usually do. Richard Connor. And this is my wife, Melissa. It was almost like an afterthought. She glanced at me briefly, smiled politely. Then her attention went right back to Richard. I felt invisible at my own table. Throughout the dinner, I watched Richard watch her. Every time she passed our table, his eyes followed her. When she laughed at something another guest said, he smiled like he'd heard the best joke. When she refilled his water glass, he thanked her like she'd given him a precious gift. I sat there, in my beautiful dress, with my professional hair and makeup, feeling more invisible than I'd ever felt teaching in my paint-stained clothes. This stranger, this young woman serving drinks, was getting more genuine attention from my husband in one evening than I'd received in months. At one point, I reached over and touched Richard's hand. "Are you okay? You seem distracted." He pulled his hand away, irritated. "I'm fine, Melissa. Can you just let me enjoy the evening?" But he wasn't enjoying me. He was enjoying watching her. After dinner, during the mingling portion of the evening, I lost track of Richard. I was talking to the wife of one of his business partners about some charity board meeting, barely listening, when I realized I hadn't seen him in almost 20 minutes. I excused myself and went looking for him. I found him near the service area, talking to Amber. She was on her break, leaning against the wall, and they were both laughing. Not polite social laughter, but real, genuine laughter. The kind Richard and I used to share in our early days. I stood there, partially hidden behind a column, watching my husband flirt with a woman half his age. He was animated, gesturing with his hands, his whole face lit up with an energy I hadn't seen in years. She was laughing at his jokes, touching his arm briefly, her eyes never leaving his face. And I felt something crack inside my chest. I walked up to them, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "Richard, they're about to start the auction. We should get back to our table." My voice came out sharper than I intended. He turned to me, and for a split second, I saw annoyance flash across his face. Annoyance that I'd interrupted. "I'll be there in a minute, Melissa." His tone was dismissive, like I was a child interrupting adult conversation. Amber looked between us, suddenly uncomfortable. "I should get back to work anyway. It was nice talking to you, Mr. Connor." She smiled at him one more time and walked away. Richard watched her go, then turned to me. "What was that about?" I stared at him in disbelief. What about?" "Richard, you've been staring at that girl all night. Don't you think that's inappropriate?" He laughed, actually laughed, like I'd said something ridiculous. "You're being paranoid, Melissa. I was just being friendly. You're always telling me I should be nicer to service staff." We went back to our table, but the rest of the evening was unbearable. The auction started, expensive items being bid on by people who could afford to waste money, but I couldn't focus on any of it. Richard bid on a golf package with some business associates, won it for $12,000, and barely acknowledged my presence beside him. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift across the room, searching, looking for her. I knew it with absolute certainty. I sat there feeling humiliated, angry, hurt, confused. Was I being paranoid? Was I overreacting? But the way he'd looked at her, the way his whole energy had shifted, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something had changed. Or maybe something had been changing for a long time, and I was only just now seeing it clearly. The woman I saw him looking at with such interest wasn't special or extraordinary. She was just young and new, and not me. Near the end of the evening, as people were finishing dessert and the orchestra was playing softer music, Richard suddenly stood up. Without warning, without telling me what he was doing, he walked toward the stage where the event organizers had been making announcements all night. My heart started pounding. What was he doing? He spoke briefly to the MC, who looked surprised but handed him the microphone. Richard walked to the center of the stage, and the room gradually quieted down. 200 faces turned toward him. The spotlight hit him, and he looked powerful, confident, in control. My stomach twisted with a feeling I couldn't name. Dread, maybe, or intuition. "I have an important announcement to make," he said, his voice booming through the speakers. I smiled nervously, thinking maybe he was going to make a large donation or thank someone. I was so wrong. "I can't live a lie anymore," Richard said, his voice steady and clear. The room went completely silent. "Melissa," he looked directly at me, and I felt every eye in that ballroom follow his gaze. "I want a divorce." I've met someone who makes me feel truly alive for the first time in years. Someone who reminds me what passion feels like. The words hit me like physical blows. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not like this. People were gasping, whispering, already pulling out their phones. I saw shock on some faces, delight on others, the kind of scandalous entertainment wealthy people crave. Then Richard did something that shattered whatever was left of my heart. He gestured toward the side of the room. "Amber, could you come here?" And she did. The young waitress walked toward the stage, looking uncertain, and Richard held out his hand to her. She took it, and he pulled her up onto the stage beside him. He was leaving me for the waitress, in front of 200 people, at a charity gala. My world exploded into a million pieces. I don't remember clearly what happened next. It's like my brain couldn't process the magnitude of what had just occurred. I remember running, pushing past tables, past people, past shocked faces, and phones pointed at me like weapons. Someone tried to stop me. Maybe Patricia? I'm not sure. I heard my name being called, but it sounded distant, like I was underwater. My heels clicked frantically on the marble floor as I ran toward the exit, my vision blurred by tears. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of 200 voices rising into chaos, the sound of my life being discussed, dissected, turned into gossip. By the time I reached the hotel lobby, I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. The valet looked at me with pity as I waited for a taxi, still wearing my beautiful navy dress, my diamond earrings catching the light, a picture of wealth and complete devastation. 3 weeks later, I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment in Allston, one of Boston's less expensive neighborhoods. The contrast from our Brookline mansion was almost comical, if anything about my situation could be called funny. My new home was 600 square feet with thin walls, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, and a bathroom with perpetually dripping faucet I couldn't afford to fix. Richard's lawyers had worked fast, brutally fast. Apparently, he'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, making sure every asset was protected, every account secured in his name alone. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed 8 years ago, barely reading it because I was so in love and trusted him completely, turned out to be ironclad. I got almost nothing. A small settlement that would last me maybe 6 months if I was careful. And that was it. 8 years of my life. And I walked away with less than I'd started with. The first 2 weeks in that apartment, I barely got out of bed. I'd wake up and immediately remember everything, and the weight of it would pin me down like a physical force. I stopped showering regularly. I ate crackers and peanut butter because I couldn't summon the energy to cook. My phone never stopped buzzing with notifications. The video of Richard's announcement had gone viral, just like I'd feared. Millions of views across social media. Articles in online magazines with headlines like "Boston Entrepreneur Dumps Wife at Charity Gala for Younger Waitress" and "Public Divorce. When Wealthy Couples Break Up Spectacularly." My face was everywhere, frozen in that moment of shock and betrayal. Strangers were commenting on everything, my appearance, my marriage, speculating about what I must have done wrong to drive my husband into another woman's arms. The internet can be so cruel to women in pain. The worst part was watching my so-called friends disappear. The women I'd spent 5 years attending charity lunches with, planning fundraisers with, women I considered friends, stopped returning my calls within days. I'd text asking if we could meet for coffee, and I'd get responses like, "I'm so sorry about what happened, but I'm really busy right now." Or worse, no response at all. I understood, in a cynical way. I wasn't Mrs. Richard Connor anymore. I had no social status, no connections to offer, no value in their world of networking and climbing social ladders. They'd moved on to the next wealthy wife, the next useful friendship. I saw photos on social media of them at events together, smiling, living their lives like I'd never existed. It hurt almost as much as Richard's betrayal. Maybe more, because I'd never expected it from them. I thought at least some of those relationships were real. There was one person who didn't abandon me. Patricia Hughes, my best friend since college, the only friendship I'd maintained from before Richard. Patricia was a lawyer, sharp as a knife and twice as tough, the kind of woman who took no prisoners in court or in life. She showed up at my apartment every single day for those first 2 weeks. She brought groceries I couldn't afford. She sat with me while I cried until I had no tears left. She helped me unpack boxes when I couldn't find the strength. Melissa, I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you're going to survive this, she said one afternoon, sitting on my ratty secondhand couch, holding my hand. That man is a coward and a fool. What he did to you was unforgivable, but you are stronger than you know. I wanted to believe her, but I felt like a shell of a person, hollowed out and empty. Patricia was the one who forced me to face reality. You need a job, Melissa. That settlement money won't last forever. The thought of working again after 8 years terrified me. What could I do? I've been out of teaching for so long. Your teaching certification is still valid, Patricia reminded me, pulling up job listings on her laptop. Look, Lincoln Community School has an opening. Not full-time, but it's something. It's a start. I stare at the listing, my old school, the place I'd walked away from 8 years ago. Could I go back? Would they even want me? I don't know if I can face those kids, Patricia. I'm such a mess. How can I teach anyone anything when my own life is in shambles? She looked at me with fierce determination. Because those kids need you. And more importantly, you need them. You need purpose. You need structure. You need to remember who you were before Richard Connor made you forget. I started going to church, something I hadn't done regularly since my wedding. There was a small Catholic church 2 blocks from my apartment, St. Anthony's, with beautiful stained glass windows and an old priest named Father Michael who had kind eyes and a gentle voice. I'd slip into the back pew during quiet afternoons when no one else was there, and I'd just sit, trying to find some sense of peace or understanding. One day, Father Michael sat down beside me. You've been coming here a lot lately, he said softly. Would you like to talk? And suddenly, I was telling him everything. The whole story poured out of me, 8 years of slowly losing myself, the humiliation of that night, the pain of starting over with nothing. Why did God let this happen to me? Father, I was a good wife. I loved him. I gave up everything for him. Why wasn't I enough? I sobbed, my voice echoing in the empty church. Father Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that started to shift something inside me. Melissa, what happened to you is cruel and unfair, and the pain you feel is valid and real. But I want you to consider something. Sometimes God allows us to lose everything so we can discover who we are without all the things we thought defined us. You weren't Mrs. Richard Connor, living in that mansion, attending those parties, wearing those diamonds. That was a role you played, a costume you wore. The question now is, who is Melissa? Not as someone's wife, not as someone's accessory, but as herself. Who is she? His words struck something deep inside me. I've been crying about losing Richard, losing the house, losing the life I'd built, but maybe I hadn't really lost anything. Maybe I'd been lost for 8 years, and now I had a chance to find myself again. It was a terrifying thought, but also strangely freeing. With Patricia's encouragement and Father Michael's words echoing in my mind, I applied for the part-time art teaching position at Lincoln Community School. I walked into that building with my heart pounding, wearing clothes from Target instead of designer labels, carrying a resume that had an 8-year gap. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, remembered me. Melissa Connor, she said, surprise in her voice. I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. The pity in her eyes made me want to run, but I forced myself to stay. I know I've been gone a long time, but teaching is what I'm meant to do. These kids need someone who understands them, and I need to remember who I was before I forgot. Mrs. Rodriguez studied me for a moment, then smiled. We have a part-time position, 3 days a week. It doesn't pay much. I nearly laughed. I don't need much anymore. She extended her hand. Welcome back, Miss Connor. The kids are going to be so happy. My first day back at Lincoln Community School was both terrifying and healing. I walked into that classroom, and it smelled exactly the same, that mixture of paint and possibility. The students were curious about me. Some had probably seen the viral video, but kids are surprisingly kind when given the chance. I told them the truth, a simplified version. I used to teach here a long time ago. I left, and I thought I wanted a different life, but I was wrong. So I came back because this is where I belong. One girl in the back, with purple streaks in her hair and guarded eyes, raised her hand. Do you regret it? Leaving? I thought about that question, really thought about it. Yes and no. I regret losing myself. But I don't regret the journey that brought me back here to you. Sometimes we have to get lost to learn how to find our way home. As I watched them start sketching, their faces focused and peaceful, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. A tiny spark of hope. Maybe Father Michael was right. Maybe this devastation was the beginning of discovering who Melissa really was. 2 years passed, and they changed me in ways I never could have imagined. The woman who walked into Lincoln Community School that first day, broken and barely holding herself together, was gone. In her place was someone I was actually starting to like. Someone I was proud to be. I'd stopped wearing designer clothes I couldn't afford to replace, and instead wore comfortable jeans, oversized sweaters, and sneakers covered in paint splatters. My hair was simpler, often pulled back in a messy bun. I wore less makeup, laughed more easily, and discovered I actually had opinions about things beyond which charity to support. Teaching gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost: my sense of purpose, my identity, my soul. Every day, I walked into that classroom and saw kids who needed someone to believe in them. And in teaching them, I learned to believe in myself again. I developed a routine, something that grounded me and made me feel like I belonged somewhere again. Every morning before school, I'd stop at Brewster's Coffee, a small independent coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment. It was nothing fancy, just mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and the best coffee in Boston. The owner, Thomas Bennett, was a quiet man around 40 with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile. He was a widower, I'd learned from the barista. His wife had died of cancer 4 years ago, and he'd opened the coffee shop as a way to keep living, to keep moving forward. There was something about his quiet strength that resonated with me. We started with simple exchanges, good morning, and the usual. But over weeks and months, those exchanges grew into real conversations. Thomas had a way of asking questions that made me actually think about my answers instead of just giving polite responses. "What are you teaching the kids this week?" he'd ask, genuinely interested. I'd tell him about the project we were working on, how one shy student had finally opened up through painting, and he'd listen like it was the most important thing he'd heard all day. He told me about running the coffee shop, the challenges of being a small business owner, how he'd learned to bake his wife's recipes to keep her memory alive. Our conversations were real, honest, without pretense or performance. He never treated me like damaged goods or asked about the divorce unless I brought it up. He just treated me like Melissa, a person worth knowing, and that meant more to me than I could express. Slowly, carefully, without either of us really planning it, we became friends. Patricia had convinced me to start seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chun, a woman in her 50s who specialized in helping people rebuild their identities after major life transitions. At first, I resisted. Therapy felt like admitting I was broken, and I'd spent 2 years trying to prove I wasn't. But Patricia was persistent, even offering to pay for the first few sessions until I could afford it myself. Melissa, being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means being brave enough to ask for help. So I went, and Dr. Chun changed my life in ways I never expected. She didn't just help me process the divorce. She helped me understand the patterns that had led me there. "Tell me about your relationship with your mother," she said in one of our early sessions. And suddenly we were unpacking years of being taught that a woman's value came from being needed, from sacrificing, from making others comfortable even at the expense of herself. I based my entire identity on being Richard's wife, I told Dr. Chen one afternoon, tears streaming down my face as I finally understood. I thought that was love, giving up everything for him. But I wasn't being selfless, I was being self-erasing. I deleted myself, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but this empty shell playing a role. Dr. Chen nodded, her expression compassionate but firm. "And what you're learning now, Melissa, is that real love doesn't require you to disappear. Real love celebrates who you are, not who you're willing to become for someone else. The work you're doing now, rediscovering yourself, learning to value your own needs and dreams, that's not selfish. That's survival. That's healing. That's reclaiming your life." Her words unlocked something inside me. I'd spent so long feeling guilty for being angry, for being hurt, for not being enough. But maybe the problem was never that I wasn't enough. Maybe the problem was that I'd made myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. One evening, about 2.5 years after the divorce, I was sitting in my tiny apartment with a cup of tea, sketching ideas in a notebook. I've been thinking about how much the art program meant to my students, how it gave them a safe space to express themselves, to be seen and valued. But we were always struggling with funding, always making do with donated supplies and cramped space. What if there was a place specifically for kids like them? I thought, a community gallery where young artists from underprivileged backgrounds could display their work, where people could see their talent instead of just their circumstances. The idea started small, but grew rapidly in my mind. A space that wasn't just about art, but about dignity, opportunity, visibility. I stayed up until 3 in the morning that night, sketching plans, researching community grants, imagining what it could look like. For the first time since before Richard, I felt truly excited about something. This was mine, my dream, my purpose. I called Patricia the next morning, barely coherent with excitement. I want to open a community art gallery for underprivileged youth. I know it sounds crazy. I have no money, no business experience, but Patricia, I can't stop thinking about it. These kids deserve to have their work seen, to be taken seriously as artists. There was a pause. Then Patricia laughed, that wonderful sound of genuine delight. That's not crazy, Melissa. That's brilliant. And you're not doing this alone. I'll help you with the legal paperwork, the nonprofit status, all of that. We'll figure this out together. Over the next few months, we met regularly at Brewster's Coffee, spreading papers across Thomas's best table while he kept our mugs filled and occasionally offered his own insights. He'd run a small business. He understood logistics, permits, community relations. You'll need backing from established community members, he said one afternoon. People who can vouch for you and help spread the word. That's when I thought of Father Michael. I went to St. Anthony's and presented my idea to him, my hands shaking as I laid out my plans, my budget, my vision. These kids need more than just our classes. They need to be seen as valuable members of our community, as people with gifts to share. I want to create that space for them, Father. But I need help. I need support. Father Michael studied my presentation, then looked at me with those kind eyes that had seen me at my lowest point. Melissa, do you remember when you first came to this church? You were lost, broken, asking why God had let this happen to you. Look at you now. You're not asking why anymore. You're asking how. How can I make a difference? How can I help others? That transformation is the answer to your old question. We have an unused storage space in the church basement. It's yours if you want it. We can renovate it together as a community. The next 3 months were a blur of activity, the most purposeful and alive I'd felt in years. Father Michael rallied the church community, and suddenly I had volunteers helping renovate the basement space, painting walls, installing lighting, building display panels. Thomas closed his coffee shop early several evenings to come help with construction. Patricia worked tirelessly on the legal paperwork, establishing the gallery as a proper nonprofit. My students from Lincoln Community School were thrilled, already creating pieces for the inaugural exhibition. Local businesses started donating art supplies when word spread about what we were building. I worked 12-hour days, teaching in the morning and renovating in the evening, and I'd never felt more exhausted or more fulfilled. This was what purpose felt like. This was what it meant to build something real, something that mattered, something that was authentically mine and not just an extension of someone else's life. The day we opened the doors to what we called New Canvas Community Gallery, I stood in the center of the space and felt something I hadn't felt in almost a decade. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. The walls were covered with artwork created by my students and other young artists from the neighborhood, each piece displayed with the same care and respect you'd find in any professional gallery. There was talent here, raw and real and powerful. 50 people showed up for our opening, including many from Father Michael's congregation, Thomas and his coffee shop regulars, Patricia and some of her colleagues, teachers from the school, and most importantly, the young artists themselves with their families. I watched a 17-year-old named Marcus explain his painting to a couple who wanted to purchase it, watched his mother cry with pride. This was what rebuilding looked like. Not going back to who I was before Richard, but becoming someone entirely new. Someone stronger, more purposeful, more authentically herself. I'd found my peace, not in another person, but in the life I'd built with my own hands. While Melissa was rebuilding her life with purpose and authenticity, Richard's life was spiraling in the opposite direction, though he didn't see it coming. In those first months after the divorce, he felt like a man reborn. Amber moved into the Brookline mansion within 2 weeks of that disastrous gala, and suddenly the house that had felt cold with Melissa felt alive with Amber's energy. She was young, vibrant, spontaneous in ways that made Richard feel young too. She wanted to go shopping, so he took her to Newberry Street and watched her light up at every designer store. She wanted jewelry. He bought her a diamond bracelet that cost more than most people's cars. She wanted to travel. He booked trips to Paris, to the Maldives, to everywhere she dreamed of going. He was spending money at a rate he never had before, but he didn't care. This was what passion felt like, he told himself. This was what he'd been missing with Melissa. Amber's friends became their social circle, and they were nothing like the business associates and society-wise Richard was used to. They were younger, louder, always looking for the next party, the next thrill. At first, Richard found it exciting, liberating even. But slowly, he started noticing things. The way Amber's friends would exchange glances when he picked up the check, which was always. The way conversations would stop when he entered the room, then resume with forced casualness. The way Amber would disappear for hours with her phone, claiming she was just texting friends, but angling the screen away when he got close. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was just adjusting to a different lifestyle. But there was a voice in the back of his mind, sounding uncomfortably like Melissa, saying, "Are you sure this is real?" 6 months into their relationship, Amber started dropping hints about investment opportunities. Her friend Marcus had this amazing cryptocurrency startup that was about to explode. Her former roommate's boyfriend was launching a nightclub and just needed seed money. Her cousin was developing an app that would revolutionize social media. Every conversation seemed to lead back to some business venture that needed funding. "You're so smart about business, Richard," she'd say, running her fingers through his hair. "These are young entrepreneurs who just need someone with vision to believe in them. Like you." Against his better judgment and ignoring the advice of his financial advisor, Richard started writing checks. 50,000 here, 100,000 there. He wanted to impress Amber, wanted to be seen as the successful, visionary man who could spot opportunities. He wanted to prove he was still relevant in this younger world she inhabited. At the same time, Richard's actual business was starting to suffer. He was distracted, taking long lunches, leaving early, sometimes not showing up to important meetings because Amber wanted to do something spontaneous. His business partners, men who'd been with him for years, started expressing concerns. "Richard, you missed the Hartford presentation. That account was worth $2 million, and they went with our competitor because you weren't there to close the deal." He'd brush it off, make excuses, promise to do better. But the truth was his priorities had shifted. Connor Solutions, the company he'd built from nothing, was no longer his primary focus. Amber was. Making her happy was. Proving that leaving Melissa for her had been the right choice was. Client relationships that had taken years to build started falling apart. Contracts weren't renewed. His reputation for reliability, which had been his greatest asset, was crumbling. A year into the relationship, Richard had to face some harsh realities. Every single investment Amber had encouraged him to make had failed spectacularly. The cryptocurrency startup was a scam. The founders disappeared with investor money. The nightclub closed after 3 months, buried in debt and legal issues. The revolutionary app never even launched. He'd lost over $600,000 on these opportunities, and that was just the beginning. His business was hemorrhaging money due to lost contracts and his own neglect. His partners were talking about buying him out, essentially forcing him to leave the company he'd created. Meanwhile, Amber was spending money faster than ever. Designer clothes piled up in closets, expensive meals at trendy restaurants, a new luxury SUV she absolutely had to have. When he tried to talk to her about cutting back, she'd pout and say things like, "I thought you wanted me to be happy, or are you saying you can't afford me?" And he'd back down, terrified of losing her, of admitting that maybe he'd made a terrible mistake. The breaking point started 2 years into their relationship. Richard planned a romantic dinner for Amber's birthday, booked her favorite restaurant, bought her an expensive necklace he truly couldn't afford anymore. She showed up an hour late, barely apologized, and spent most of dinner on her phone. "Amber, who are you texting?" he finally asked, frustration breaking through. "Just friends," she said dismissively. "Why are you being so controlling? You're starting to sound old." The word hit him like a slap. Old. That's how she saw him now. Not as the successful, attractive man who'd swept her off her feet, but as an aging, boring man who was cramping her style. He looked across the table at this beautiful young woman who'd cost him his marriage, his business, his reputation, and suddenly he didn't recognize her. Or maybe he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the love of his life, but as someone who'd seen an opportunity and taken it. 3 months later, Richard came home early from a failed business meeting to find Amber in the living room with a man he'd never seen before. Younger than Richard, maybe 30, wearing an expensive suit and an expensive watch. They were sitting close, her hand on his knee, both looking guilty when Richard walked in. "Richard, you're home early," Amber said, not even trying to hide her annoyance. "This is Brandon. He's a real estate developer I've been telling you about." But the way she said it, the way they looked at each other, Richard knew. He absolutely knew. "How long?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Amber had the audacity to look offended. "Excuse me? Are you accusing me of something?" Brandon stood up, smug smile on his face. "I should go. Amber, we'll continue our discussion later." He walked past Richard like he owned the place, and Richard did nothing. Just stood there, frozen, watching his world collapse for the second time in 3 years. After Brandon left, Richard confronted Amber directly. "Tell me the truth. Are you seeing him?" She laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was cruel. "You really want to do this now?" "Fine. Yes, Richard. I've been seeing Brandon for 4 months. He's closer to my age, he's actually fun, and he's richer than you. Way richer. You want to know the truth? I never loved you. I saw an opportunity that night at the gala. A wealthy, lonely man having a midlife crisis, so desperate for excitement that he'd blow up his entire life for a pretty face. You were easy, Richard. So easy. Each word was a knife. All those investments you made, my friends, and I got kickbacks from those entrepreneurs. That 50,000 you invested in Marcus's crypto, we split it. You were our ATM, and you were too blinded by ego to see it." Richard felt physically ill. Everything, all of it, had been a manipulation, a game, and he'd been the fool. "I want you to leave," Richard said, his voice shaking. Amber shrugged, completely unbothered. "I was planning to anyway. Brandon has a penthouse downtown, way nicer than this place, which, by the way, I heard you're about to lose to the bank." How did she know that? Had she been going through his financial papers? "You're pathetic, Richard. You threw away a good woman, a real marriage, for what? Some excitement? Some ego boost? And now look at you. Broke, alone, your business failing, and everyone in Boston knows you're a joke. That viral video of you humiliating your wife? People still talk about it. They laugh at you. The mighty Richard Connor who destroyed his own life for a waitress who never even liked him." She grabbed her designer bags, the ones he'd bought her, and headed for the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Oh, and Richard, your wife Melissa? She was always too good for you. I hope she's living her best life, because she deserves it. You deserve this." And she was gone. Richard sat in that enormous mansion, alone in a way he'd never been alone before. The silence was deafening. For the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to really think about Melissa. Not the version of her he'd told himself about, the cold, boring wife who didn't understand him, but the real Melissa, the woman who'd given up her dreams to support his, who'd stood by him for 8 years, who'd loved him unconditionally until he threw her away in the most public, humiliating way possible. He destroyed a good woman's life for a fantasy, for ego, for a young woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a wallet. Everything Amber had said was true. He was pathetic. His business was collapsing. He'd have to sell the mansion to pay his debts. His reputation was ruined, and he had no one to blame but himself. He thought about calling Melissa, but what would he even say? How do you apologize for destroying someone's life? He sat there in the dark as reality crushed down on him. He'd lost everything that mattered, and it was entirely his own fault. 3 years ago, he'd had everything. Now he had nothing but regret and shame. And somewhere in Boston, Melissa was probably living a better life without him. He hoped she was. God, he hoped she was happy, because he destroyed any chance of his own happiness the night he took that microphone. 6 months after Amber left, Richard was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, a working-class neighborhood he would have never considered before. The contrast from the Brookline mansion was almost surreal. He'd lost the house to foreclosure, sold most of his possessions to pay debts, and filed for bankruptcy to deal with the financial wreckage of his failed investments and collapsed business. His former partners had bought him out for a fraction of what the company was worth, and he was lucky to get even that. He drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic now, bought used from a lot that advertised no credit check financing. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by clothes from Target and Old Navy. The man who'd once closed million-dollar deals was now working as a business consultant for a small firm, making a modest salary that barely covered rent and basic expenses. He'd fallen so far, and every morning he woke up shocked by how completely his life had disintegrated. The hardest part wasn't the financial devastation, though that was painful enough. The hardest part was the isolation. Every single person from his old life was gone. His business partners wanted nothing to do with him after the company's near collapse. The society friends he'd networked with for years stopped returning calls immediately after the scandal. Even distant relatives had distanced themselves, embarrassed by his public disgrace. He'd scroll through his phone looking at contacts, hundreds of names, and realize he couldn't call any of them. There was no one. He'd sacrificed his marriage, his integrity, his reputation, all for a woman who'd never cared about him. And now he was paying the price in crushing loneliness. Some evenings, he'd sit in his small apartment and realize he hadn't spoken to another human being in days except to order food or exchange pleasantries with his landlord. This was what rock bottom felt like. Empty, silent, suffocating. One Sunday morning, Richard found himself standing outside St. Anthony's Catholic Church. He wasn't sure what had brought him there. He wasn't particularly religious, hadn't been to church regularly since childhood, but something about the stone building with its simple cross seemed to call to him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the crushing weight of guilt that followed him everywhere. Maybe he was just looking for somewhere, anywhere, that might offer him some kind of peace or answer. He watched families enter the church, couples holding hands, elderly people greeting each other warmly, and he felt like an outsider looking through a window at a life he'd thrown away. After standing there for almost 20 minutes, working up courage, he finally walked through the doors. The interior was quiet, peaceful, with beautiful stained glass windows casting colored light across wooden pews. He sat in the very back, hoping to be invisible, just wanted to be somewhere that felt safe. After the service, as Richard sat alone while others filed out, an older priest with gray hair and kind eyes approached him. "I haven't seen you here before. I'm Father Michael." Richard looked up, surprised anyone had noticed him. "Richard, I'm not really sure why I'm here." Father Michael smiled gently and sat down in the pew beside him. "That's often the best reason to be in church. When we don't have answers, when we're searching. This is a good place for that." There was something about the priest's calm presence that made Richard feel like he could breathe for the first time in months. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard found himself talking, the words pouring out like a dam breaking. "I destroyed my life, Father. I destroyed another person's life. I threw away everything that mattered for something that was never real. And now I have nothing. No one. I don't know how to live with what I've done." Father Michael listened without judgment as Richard confessed everything. The affair, the public humiliation of his wife, the financial ruin, the manipulation by Amber, all of it. He left nothing out, And with each word he felt both lighter and heavier, the relief of finally being honest warring with the shame of hearing his actions spoken aloud. When Richard finally finished, emotionally exhausted, Father Michael was quiet for a long moment. What you did was wrong, Richard. Deeply wrong. You hurt someone who trusted you. You acted with arrogance and selfishness, and you're experiencing the natural consequences of those choices. Richard nodded, tears in his eyes. He'd expected judgment, and he deserved it. But then Father Michael continued. However, consequences are not the same as condemnation. You're here, which means some part of you wants to be better than the worst thing you've done. That matters. The question isn't whether you can be forgiven, it's whether you're truly ready to change. I don't even know where to start, Richard said, his voice breaking. How do you make amends for destroying someone's life? My ex-wife, Melissa, I humiliated her in front of hundreds of people. I see that video sometimes online, and I feel sick. She gave up everything for me, and I threw her away like garbage. How does someone come back from that? How do you apologize for something so unforgivable? Father Michael considered this carefully. You may never be able to fully make amends, Richard. Some hurt runs too deep for simple apologies. But redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about becoming someone different in the present. It starts with genuine repentance, not just feeling bad about consequences, but truly understanding the pain you caused and committing to never being that person again. Can you do that? Richard thought about Melissa, really thought about her for the first time in years, not as the wife he'd grown bored with, but as a person he'd devastated. I want to try. God, I want to try. Father Michael became Richard's unlikely guide over the following months. He invited Richard to volunteer at the church's community programs, serving meals at the soup kitchen, helping with food distribution for struggling families. At first, Richard felt awkward and out of place, but gradually something shifted. He met people who'd lost everything through circumstances beyond their control, people who were kind and dignified despite having nothing, people who didn't know or care who Richard Connor used to be. A homeless veteran named James shared his story over coffee one afternoon, talking about losing his family to addiction. The hardest part wasn't losing the house or the job, James said. It was losing myself, losing my integrity. Getting that back, that's the real work. His words hit Richard hard. That's exactly what he'd done, lost his integrity, and the work of getting it back was painful and slow, but necessary. He started attending church regularly, not because he was suddenly deeply religious, but because it was a place that reminded him to be better. One afternoon, Richard sat in the confession booth, something he hadn't done since childhood. Father Michael, I need to ask you something that's been haunting me. Can God forgive someone like me? Can God forgive someone who willfully destroyed a good person's life for selfish reasons? Who acted with such cruel arrogance? There was a pause. Then Father Michael's voice came through the screen, gentle but firm. God can forgive anyone who truly repents, Richard. That's the whole point of grace. But forgiveness from God doesn't erase consequences in this world. It doesn't mean the person you hurt has to forgive you or take you back. It doesn't erase your responsibility to make whatever amends you can. Divine forgiveness gives you the strength to face those earthly realities with humility and accept whatever outcome comes. The real question is, can you forgive yourself enough to become the man you should have been all along? That night, Richard sat at his small kitchen table and tried to write a letter to Melissa. He must have started 20 times, crumpling page after page. How do you write an apology for something so massive? Dear Melissa, I'm sorry, felt pathetically inadequate. He finally managed to write something honest. Melissa, I know words cannot undo the pain I caused you. I humiliated you publicly. I threw away 8 years of your devotion and love. I acted with unforgivable cruelty. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I just need you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed it through my own arrogance and selfishness. I hope you found happiness. I hope you've built a life that brings you peace. You deserve every good thing. I'm so deeply sorry. He addressed the envelope but didn't send it. Not yet. He needed to make sure his motives were pure, that he wasn't seeking her forgiveness to ease his own guilt, but truly acknowledging her pain. Several weeks later, Richard stood with Father Michael after evening service. "I need to see Melissa," Richard said quietly. "I need to apologize to her in person, to let her look me in the eyes and see that I truly understand what I did. I don't want anything from her. I don't expect anything, but she deserves to hear me take full responsibility without excuses." Father Michael studied him carefully. "Are you sure you're ready for that? She may not want to see you. She may tell you exactly what she thinks of you, and it won't be pleasant. Can you accept that? Can you face her knowing you might leave feeling worse than you do now?" Richard nodded slowly. "I have to try. For 3 years, I've been living with this guilt, this shame. Not because I lost everything, but because I finally understand what I took from her. Her dignity, her security, her trust. If there's any chance of making even the smallest amend, of giving her the closure of a genuine apology, I have to take it. Even if she slams the door in my face, even if she tells me she hates me, she deserves that opportunity." Father Michael put a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Then go. Face what you've done with humility and honesty. And whatever happens, accept it with grace." Richard made his decision. He would find Melissa and beg for a chance to apologize. Not for himself, but for her. 5 years after that devastating night at the charity gala, Richard stood across the street from the new Canvas Community Gallery, his hands shaking. He'd spent weeks trying to find Melissa, finally learning through careful inquiries that she taught art at Lincoln Community School and had opened this gallery. Tonight was the grand opening celebration, and through the large windows he could see her inside, surrounded by people, smiling genuinely in a way he'd never seen her smile when they were married. She looked different, simpler, wearing jeans and a colorful cardigan instead of designer clothes, her hair in a natural style. And she looked happy. Truly, authentically happy. He'd practiced what he would say 1,000 times, but now that he was here, every word felt inadequate. What right did he have to intrude on her happiness? But he'd come this far, and she deserved to hear him take responsibility. He took a deep breath and crossed the street. Inside the gallery, Melissa was experiencing one of the best nights of her life. The opening was a success beyond her wildest dreams. Over 60 people had shown up, community members, teachers from the school, local business owners, and most importantly, her students and their families. The walls were covered with vibrant, powerful artwork created by young people who'd rarely been given a platform before. She watched Marcus, one of her most talented students, explaining his painting technique to a couple who wanted to purchase his piece. Patricia stood beside her, beaming with pride. "You did this, Melissa. You built something real and beautiful." Thomas approached with a tray of refreshments he'd donated from his coffee shop, his warm smile making her heart feel full. Over the past year, their friendship had deepened into something more, though they were taking it slowly, both having learned from past pain. She felt surrounded by genuine love and support, by people who saw her for who she truly was. Then Melissa looked toward the entrance, and her entire world stopped. Richard, standing in the doorway of her gallery, looking nothing like the man she'd known. He was thinner, his clothes were simple and worn, his hair needed cutting, and his eyes, those blue eyes that had once looked at her with boredom, now looked at her with something that resembled desperation and shame. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. 5 years dissolved in an instant, and she was back in that ballroom, hearing him announce their divorce in front of hundreds of people. Patricia noticed immediately and moved closer to Melissa's side. "Do you want me to ask him to leave?" Patricia asked quietly, her lawyer instincts kicking in, ready to protect her friend. But Melissa shook her head, unable to look away from Richard. She needed to know why he was here. What could he possibly want after all this time? Melissa walked toward Richard, her heart pounding, Patricia following a few steps behind like a protective guardian. As she got closer, she could see the changes in him more clearly. This wasn't the arrogant, confident Richard Connor who destroyed her life. This was someone who looked broken, humbled, and deeply ashamed. "Richard," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here?" He flinched at her tone, and she was surprised to feel nothing. No anger, no pain, just a distant curiosity. "Melissa," his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I'm intruding on your night. but I've been trying to find the courage to talk to you for months, and when I learned about your gallery opening, I thought maybe this was my chance. Could we talk? Just for a few minutes? Please." The word please sounded foreign coming from him. Melissa looked back at the gallery, at the celebration she'd worked so hard to create, then back at Richard. "We can talk outside." Briefly, she led him out to the sidewalk, keeping distance between them, very aware of Patricia watching through the window. The autumn evening was cool, and she crossed her arms, more for protection than warmth. "You have 5 minutes, Richard. Then I want you to leave and never contact me again." He nodded, accepting her terms. "That's fair. That's more than fair." He took a deep breath, and when he looked at her, his eyes were filled with tears. "Melissa, I came here to apologize. Not to ask for anything, not to try to justify what I did, just to apologize and to tell you that I finally truly understand what I did to you, and I'm so deeply sorry." His voice cracked on the last words. Richard continued, words pouring out like he'd been holding them in for years. "What I did to you at that gala was unforgivable. I humiliated you publicly. I destroyed your sense of security. I threw away your devotion and love for something that was never real. Amber never loved me. She used me for money and left the moment it ran out. My business collapsed. I lost everything, but that's not why I'm here. I'm not here because I lost everything. I'm here because I finally understand what I took from you. Your dignity, your trust, your sense of worth. You gave up your career for me, your dreams, your identity, and I repaid you with cruelty and betrayal. There's no excuse for what I did. No reason that makes it okay. I was selfish, arrogant, and blind to the gift I had in you. And I am so sorry, Melissa. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." Melissa stood there, listening to words she'd once desperately wanted to hear, and felt an unexpected emotion, pity. Not the bitter, victorious kind, but genuine compassion for this broken man who bore little resemblance to the person she'd married. "Richard," she said slowly, 5 years ago, if you'd said these words, I would have been destroyed all over again. But I'm not that woman anymore. I've done a lot of therapy, a lot of healing, a lot of growing. What you did was terrible, yes. It hurt me in ways I didn't know I could hurt. But it also freed me. I lost myself in our marriage. Richard, I made myself smaller and smaller, trying to be what you needed, and I forgot who I was. Your betrayal, as devastating as it was, forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. And the woman I became is someone I actually like. Someone with purpose and passion and genuine happiness." Richard wiped his eyes, nodding. "I can see that. I can see how happy you are, how you've built something real and meaningful. This gallery, it's beautiful, Melissa. It's exactly the kind of thing you always talked about wanting to do. I'm glad you found your way back to yourself. You deserve that chance." There was a long silence between them, 5 years of pain and growth, and separate journeys hanging in the air. "I saw you lost everything, too," Melissa said, not unkindly. "I heard about Amber leaving, about your business, about the mansion. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't feel some satisfaction at first, some sense of cosmic justice. But that faded pretty quickly. I don't want you to suffer, Richard. I just want you to understand what you did and become better because of it. Have you?" He looked at her directly. "I'm trying. Every day I'm trying." Melissa took a deep breath, knowing what she needed to say. "Richard, I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate the apology, and I can see it's genuine. But I need you to understand something clearly. I forgive you. Not for you, but for me, because holding on to anger and bitterness would only hurt me. I forgive you, and I hope you find peace and become a better person. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean we can be friends, or that there's any place for you in my life. What we had is over, and it's been over for a long time. I moved on, I've built a new life, and I'm genuinely happy. You need to move on too, not back to who you were, but forward to whoever you're meant to become. Can you understand that?" Richard's face showed pain, but also something like relief. "I understand completely. You're right. You deserve to live your life without me in it." They stood there for one more moment, two people who'd once promised forever to each other, now strangers on separate paths. "I hope you find happiness, Richard. Real happiness, The kind that comes from being authentic and kind and knowing your own worth. I hope you learn to love someone in a healthy way someday, and I hope you never hurt anyone the way you hurt me. Richard nodded, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, Melissa, for hearing me out, for your forgiveness, even if I don't deserve it, and for showing me what real strength looks like. You're an amazing woman, and I was too blind and stupid to see it when it mattered. I wish you every happiness. Melissa turned and walked back toward her gallery, toward the celebration, toward her real life with real friends and real purpose. She didn't look back. Richard stood there on the sidewalk, watching her go, accepting that this was goodbye. Not the beginning of a second chance, but the ending he deserved. He'd said what he came to say, and now he had to let her go completely. He turned and walked away into the night, alone but somehow lighter, carrying the weight of his mistakes but no longer crushed by them. After Richard left, Melissa stood by the gallery window, watching his figure disappear into the night. The celebration continued behind her, voices and laughter filling the space. But she felt disconnected from it all, like she was watching her own life from outside her body. Patricia appeared at her side, concern etched on her face. Are you okay? What did he say? Melissa shook her head slowly, still processing. He apologized, really apologized, not with excuses or justifications, just pure accountability. He told me he understood what he did, that he was sorry, that I deserved better. Patricia's expression hardened. And what do you think about that? After 5 years, after everything he put you through, he just shows up and apologizes like that, makes it okay. Melissa turned to look at her friend. No, it doesn't make it okay. But it was genuine, Patricia. He's not the same man. He's broken, humbled, and he seemed to really understand the pain he caused. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Melissa sat with Thomas in a quiet corner of the gallery. He'd noticed her distraction, the way she'd been somewhere else mentally for the last hour. You want to talk about it? He asked gently, no pressure in his voice. She appreciated that about Thomas. He never pushed, never demanded, just offered space. My ex-husband showed up tonight. Richard, the one who left me at that charity gala 5 years ago. Thomas's eyebrows rose, but he stayed quiet, letting her continue. He apologized, said he understood what he did, that he was sorry, that I deserve better. And Thomas, I think he meant it. He's lost everything too, his business, his money, the woman he left me for. He looked completely different, humbled and broken. Thomas studied her face carefully. How do you feel about seeing him? Melissa shook her head. I don't know. Confused? Sad? But not for the reasons I expected. That night, Melissa couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Richard over and over. 5 years ago, she would have given anything to hear him say those words, to see him recognize what he'd done. But now she felt nothing for him romantically, no desire to rekindle anything, no hope for reconciliation. So why did seeing him bother her so much? Maybe it was because his brokenness reminded her of her own journey. She remembered how it felt to be at rock bottom, to have lost everything, to not recognize herself in the mirror. She'd had Patricia, Father Michael, Thomas, her students, people who'd lifted her up when she couldn't stand. Who did Richard have? The thought kept her awake, wrestling with questions she didn't want to ask. What was her responsibility here, if any? Did forgiveness mean she should help him? Or did healthy boundaries mean she should walk away completely? The next morning, Melissa found herself at St. Anthony's, sitting in a pew with Father Michael. She called him early, needing wisdom she couldn't find on her own. Father, Richard came to my gallery last night. He apologized genuinely, and I told him I forgave him. And I meant it. I do forgive him. But now I'm confused about what that means. He keeps showing up, not asking for anything specific, but clearly hoping for something. I don't feel anything romantic for him. I don't want him back, but I feel this pull to help him somehow. Is that forgiveness talking, or is it old patterns of putting his needs before mine? Father Michael was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully. That's a profound question, Melissa, and I'm glad you're asking it. It shows how much you've grown. He paused, choosing his words with care. Let me ask you something. When you said you forgave him, what did you mean by that? Melissa thought about Father Michael's question. I meant that I released the anger and bitterness I was carrying, that I don't wish him harm, that I hope he finds peace and becomes a better person, that I'm not going to let what he did continue to poison my life. Father Michael nodded approvingly. That's exactly what forgiveness is, Melissa. It's a gift you give yourself, releasing the burden of hate and vengeance. But here's what forgiveness is not. It's not reconciliation. It's not trust. It's not an obligation to let someone back into your life. You can forgive someone and still maintain firm boundaries. You can wish someone well from a distance without becoming part of their healing journey. Christian forgiveness doesn't mean Christian doormat. His words hit her like a revelation. She'd been confusing forgiveness with responsibility, thinking that if she truly forgave Richard, she had to help him, support him, give him a place in her life. But that wasn't true. Later that week, Melissa met with Patricia at her law office. Patricia had asked to talk, and Melissa could tell from her friend's expression that she had strong opinions about the Richard situation. Melissa, I love you like a sister, so I'm going to be completely honest with you. Patricia started, her lawyer voice in full effect. Richard showing up at your gallery, apologizing, showing you how broken he is, that's manipulation. Maybe not conscious manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless. He's making you feel responsible for his redemption, and that's not fair. You don't owe him anything. Not your time, not your emotional energy, certainly not a second chance. Melissa started to protest, but Patricia held up a hand. Let me finish. I watched you rebuild yourself from nothing. I saw you at your lowest point, and I saw you climb out of that pit through sheer determination and courage. You did that, not him. He doesn't get credit for your transformation just because his betrayal triggered it. Patricia continued, her voice passionate. He humiliated you in front of hundreds of people, Melissa. That video is still online. People still talk about it. He didn't just break your heart. He tried to break your spirit, your dignity, your sense of self-worth. And now he's back, looking sad and broken, and your compassionate heart wants to help him. But ask yourself this. Is helping him going to cost you your peace? Your progress? The life you've worked so hard to build? Melissa felt tears prick her eyes. I don't want him back, Patricia. I need you to understand that. I don't have romantic feelings for him anymore. But when I see him so broken, I remember how that felt. And part of me thinks, shouldn't I show compassion? Isn't that what good people do? Patricia's expression softened. Good people have boundaries, Melissa. Compassion doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. You can feel sorry for him and still protect your peace. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. That evening, Melissa met Thomas at Brewster's Coffee after he closed for the day. She needed to talk to him about Richard, about her confusion, because over the past year their friendship had evolved into something that felt like it could become more, and he deserved honesty. Thomas, I need to tell you something. Richard, my ex, he's been reaching out. He's apologized, he's clearly going through a hard time, and I'm struggling with what my responsibility is, if any. I don't have feelings for him anymore. I want you to know that. But I'm confused about boundaries and forgiveness and compassion. Thomas listened quietly, his brown eyes thoughtful. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand gently. Melissa, I appreciate you telling me this, and I'm going to share something from my own experience, if that's okay. She nodded, grateful for his calm presence. Thomas took a breath. When my wife was dying of cancer, I watched a lot of people come in and out of our lives. Some stayed and genuinely helped. Others showed up for their own emotional needs, to feel like they were good people, to ease their own guilt or discomfort with death. I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let people walk their own journey. You can't save Richard, Melissa. Only he can save himself. If you insert yourself into his healing process, you're not actually helping him. You're preventing him from doing the hard work he needs to do alone. And you're putting yourself at risk of falling back into old patterns. Melissa felt something click into place with his words. You're saying that letting him struggle is actually the compassionate choice. Thomas squeezed her hand. I'm saying that protecting your peace is not selfish, it's necessary. You've built something beautiful in your life. Don't let guilt convince you to risk it. That night, Melissa stood alone in her gallery, surrounded by the artwork of her students and she finally understood what she needed to do. Father Michael was right. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. Patricia was right. Compassion didn't mean sacrificing her peace. Thomas was right. Sometimes the kindest thing was to step back. She'd spent 8 years of her marriage making herself smaller for Richard. She'd spent 5 years rebuilding herself into someone she was proud to be. She couldn't risk that growth, that peace, that hard-won happiness, not even for compassion's sake. Richard needed to walk his own journey of redemption, and she needed to protect the life she'd built. She could forgive him, wish him well, hope he found healing, all from a healthy distance. That wasn't cold or cruel. That was self-preservation. That was wisdom. She pulled out her phone and typed a message she'd been composing in her mind all week. Short, clear, kind but firm. She was setting a boundary, and for the first time in her life, she felt no guilt about it. Only clarity. Only peace. She pressed send and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. 3 days after sending her message, Melissa sat in a neutral coffee shop. Not Thomas's place, but somewhere neither of them had history. She'd asked Richard to meet her, to have one final conversation where she could say what she needed to say with clarity and peace. When he walked in, she noticed again how different he looked, not just physically, but in his entire bearing. The arrogance that had once defined him was completely gone, replaced by humility that seemed genuine. He sat down across from her, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would after I kept reaching out. I'm sorry if I've been intrusive." Melissa shook her head gently. "You haven't been intrusive, Richard. But we need to have a clear conversation about where we stand, and I want to do it in person, looking you in the eye, so there's no misunderstanding." Melissa took a breath, gathering her thoughts. "Richard, I meant what I said at the gallery. I forgive you. I truly do. From the deepest place in my heart. I release the anger and bitterness I've carried about what you did to me. I don't wish you harm. I don't want you to suffer. I genuinely hope you find peace, become a better person, build a life that brings you fulfillment and joy. I can see that you've changed, that you're not the man you were 5 years ago, and I respect that growth." Richard's eyes filled with tears, hope flickering across his face. But Melissa held up a gentle hand. "However, I need you to understand something very clearly. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. Forgiveness is what I give myself to free my heart from poison. But reconciliation would require trust, and trust has to be earned over time through consistent behavior. And Richard, I'm not willing to invest that time or emotional energy." She could see the hope dying in his eyes, and part of her heart ached for him. But she continued. "When you asked for the divorce at that gala, in front of all those people, you didn't just end our marriage. You ended any possibility of us ever having a relationship again, romantic or otherwise. That was your choice, and choices have permanent consequences. I've spent 5 years rebuilding myself, discovering who I am without you, creating a life filled with purpose and genuine happiness. I'm not that woman you married anymore. Richard, I'm not the woman who would sacrifice her identity for someone else's needs. I've grown beyond who I was, and frankly, you're part of a past I've made peace with and moved on from." Richard swallowed hard, a tear sliding down his cheek. "So this is really goodbye?" It wasn't a question. Melissa nodded gently. "Yes, this is really goodbye." "Richard, I need you to hear something important," Melissa continued, her voice soft but clear. "You can't base your redemption on my forgiveness or my presence in your life. Your healing journey has to be about becoming a better person for yourself, not to win me back or to ease your guilt. The work you're doing, going to church, becoming humble, taking responsibility, that's good work. But you have to do it because you want to be better, not because you want me. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Richard nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "You're saying I need to let you go completely. Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. I need to stop hoping." Melissa felt a wave of compassion. "Yes, you need to stop hoping for us. But you shouldn't stop hoping for yourself. You can still build a good life, Richard. You can still find happiness and purpose. Just not with me." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup, processing everything. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Acceptance. Painful, but real. You're absolutely right, Melissa. About all of it. I think part of me was holding on to this fantasy that if I could just prove I'd changed, you'd see me differently and we could start over. But that's not fair to you, and honestly, it's not healthy for me either. I've been using the idea of winning you back as a distraction from doing the real work of figuring out who I am now. He took a shaky breath. I don't know who Richard Connor is anymore. The man I was before, the arrogant businessman, he's gone. The man who thought he found himself with Amber. That was a delusion. So who am I now? I need to figure that out on my own, don't I? Melissa smiled sadly. Yes, you do. And you can. It's hard work, believe me, I know. But it's worth it. Can I give you some advice? Melissa asked. From someone who's been where you are now. Richard nodded eagerly, like he was grasping for any lifeline. Find your purpose, Richard. Not in another relationship. Not in rebuilding your business empire. Not in reclaiming your old status. Find something that matters beyond yourself. For me, it was teaching, helping kids discover their creativity and worth. That gave me purpose when I had nothing else. Maybe for you it's volunteering or mentoring young entrepreneurs or working with Father Michael at the church. Find something that makes you feel like you're contributing to the world in a positive way. That's where real fulfillment comes from, not from someone else validating you or taking you back. Richard absorbed her words like a man dying of thirst. You become so wise, Melissa. So strong. I was a fool not to see that in you before. I need to say something, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. You were always this wise and strong, Melissa. I just didn't see it because I was too focused on myself, on what I wanted, on my own ego. You sacrificed so much for me. Your career, your dreams, your identity, and I took it all for granted. I convinced myself you were boring and cold. But the truth is, I was the one who was empty. You had depth and passion and purpose, and I was just chasing surface-level excitement. I'm so sorry I couldn't see your value when I had the privilege of being loved by you. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. His voice cracked. I hope whoever you choose to be with next, whether it's that coffee shop owner or someone else, I hope they see you clearly and treasure you the way I should have. You deserve to be cherished, Melissa. You always did. Melissa felt tears prick her own eyes, not from sadness or longing, but from the weight of this moment. This was real closure, not the dramatic, painful ending of 5 years ago, but a peaceful acknowledgement of what was and what would never be again. Thank you for saying that, Richard. It means something to hear you finally see me clearly, even if it's too late for us. They both stood, the conversation reaching its natural end. There was a moment of awkwardness, neither sure how to say goodbye to someone who had once been everything and was now nothing but a memory. Finally, Richard extended his hand. Melissa looked at it for a moment, then took it, a simple handshake between two people who'd once promised forever. Goodbye, Melissa, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Take care of yourself. Build a beautiful life. You deserve every happiness. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. Goodbye, Richard. I hope you find your way. I really do. Melissa walked out of the coffee shop into the bright morning sunlight and felt something she hadn't expected. Complete peace. No guilt, no regret, no second thoughts. She'd done the right thing, the kind thing, the healthy thing. She'd given Richard the truth with compassion, set a clear boundary without cruelty, and protected the life she'd worked so hard to build. As she walked down the street toward her car, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. 5 years ago, she'd been destroyed, humiliated, lost. But that devastation had forced her to rebuild from the ground up, to discover who she really was beyond anyone's wife or anyone's accessory. She'd found her passion, her purpose, her authentic self. And now she was walking away from her past with grace and strength, ready to embrace her future. Whatever that future held, whether it was with Thomas or someone else or no one at all, she knew she'd be okay. Because her happiness didn't depend on someone else anymore. It came from within. When Melissa arrived at her gallery an hour later, Thomas was there, as he often was now, with 2 coffees and that gentle smile that made her feel seen and valued. "How did it go?" he asked. No judgment in his voice, just genuine care. "It went well," she said, taking the coffee gratefully. "I set a clear boundary, said goodbye for real this time. It feels good. It feels right." Thomas nodded, respecting her without needing to insert himself into her process. That's what healthy looked like, she realized. Support without possession, care without control. Patricia came through the gallery door with paperwork for a grant they were applying for, calling out a cheerful greeting. Her students started arriving for the afternoon workshop, their energy and creativity filling the space with life. Melissa stood in the center of her gallery, surrounded by real friends, meaningful work, and genuine purpose, and she smiled. This was her life now. Not perfect, but authentically hers. She'd survived the worst betrayal, rebuilt herself from nothing, and emerged stronger and wiser. Sometimes people ask if forgiveness means giving someone a second chance. But here's what I learned. Forgiveness sets you free, but it doesn't obligate you to let someone back in. The greatest gift you can give yourself is knowing your worth, protecting your peace, and walking away from anything that threatens the life you built. Richard was my past, and I made peace with that. But my future? That was mine to create, and it was going to be beautiful. If you enjoyed the story, please comment where you're watching from, share your thoughts, hit that like button, and subscribe for more incredible journeys of healing, growth, and finding yourself again. Thank you for being part of this community.